Welcome to this special ILF webinar, Ancient Hatred, Modern Times. Those of you that don't know me, my name is Arsene Ostrovsky. I'm the chair and CEO of the ILF. Those of you perhaps that haven't worked with us, we are an Israel-based network, proactive hub of lawyers and advocates, some over 3,000 lawyers and advocates throughout the world, over 30 countries that are really committed to the fight against anti-Semitism first and foremost, but also to counterterrorism and against the legitimization of Israel, but specifically focusing in the international legal arena. Some of you are already part of our network, including some of our esteemed speakers and those of you that are joining us today. So I want to say, first of all, thank you for all of your support. I wanted to also especially thank our guests who will be introduced very shortly, and those of you watching. This is being streamed live on this webinar, but I must also say that we had such a demand, actually we're oversubscribed, that we're also now streaming it live on our Facebook page at the International Legal Forum, so you can share it from there as well. I only want to speak for just a few moments, and before I turn it over to Russell Shalev, our outstanding advocate and lawyer who really initiated and led this important report that we just released the other week titled Recognizing Anti-Zionist Antisemitism. I just want to say a few words. This report was many months in the drafting, and I saw firsthand the work that went into it. But it's something that undertook, I think, a whole new meaning and a sense of urgency and immediacy in the wake of what we saw in the last really weeks and months, this I think explosion of violence, assault against Jews worldwide. And I think all of us saw that, whether it's the jarring scenes in London with a convoy of cars driving through literally the center of London, screaming those horrific things, whether it's Jews being beaten up in North America. In Germany, we saw flags being burnt in Canada and Australia. Really, so much of the world, we saw this immense explosion of violence. I think we need to look at it perhaps, or I should say, we cannot look at this in a vacuum. This didn't occur out of nowhere. This is in so many ways a direct result of this pervasive discourse over the years that has really vilified the state of Israel, vilified the Jewish state, demonizing us, all under the pretext of criticism that really goes beyond the pale against Israel, against Zionism. And what we've seen, I think, throughout history, and again, it's something that's been underscored only just recently, is that at the end of the day, words have consequences, words have meaning, words have ramifications. And what we've seen is that such hate, such visceral hate, incitement and peddling and anti-Semitic tropes directly leads also to violence against Jews, whether that is in North America, whether that is in Europe or South Africa or elsewhere throughout the world. So I think what we really would like to do during this special webinar is to speak to our esteemed guests, all experts in their respective fields throughout the world, to hear their perspectives about what is happening in their communities, to hear about the sources of this hate, and I think equally importantly, if not even more so, where we go from here. Because we at some point we say enough is enough. We know that this is bad. We know that Jews are afraid. We know that they are hiding their identities. What do we do? What can we do? How can we stop this? So we'll get some important insight on that from our guests. Russell will introduce all of them very shortly. For those of you that are watching live, you can also ask questions in the chat option down below, and we'll do our best to try and get through them. We've already had a number of fantastic questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can in this conversation. Before I hand it over to Russell, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Jacob Dallal. Jacob is the Director of Academic Affairs from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, who really have been one of the leading voices here in Israel in terms of combating this hate, in terms of taking action both against the delegitimization of Israel, against the boycott movement, and also against all these manifestations of anti-Semitism that we'll be discussing. Jacob, I hand it over to you now for a few minutes and some introductory remarks, and then Russell will introduce our wonderful guests, and we'll have a conversation. Jacob.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the International Legal Forum for all the work it's been doing over the years, and especially for the recent document. I think it's really important to put our feet in the water, or to put our whole bodies in the water, and start discussing this in a thorough, serious fashion. And the document certainly does that. And Russell, you've worked very hard on it, so personal congratulations. You know, when we started at the ministry several years ago to focus on the issues around delegitimization in the BDS movement, no one thought of anti-Semitism. We were reminded something else. And it really was with after a year or two into it, about 2 years ago, that we realized this is a critical issue. It's a critical issue for the obvious reason, because you know, this is a form of anti-Semitism. But I actually want to share with you why I think it's a critical reason, a critical issue for a different reason, even a tactical reason. You know, one of the things that the pro-Israel community has pulled out its hair over is, how do we change the conversation? And the conversation was almost exclusively, you know, Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's a illegitimate entity, etc. And how do we say, oh, as opposed to saying, no, we're not, how do we talk about something else? And for better or for worse, this conversation, namely, is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, that is the alternative conversation to be had. And it lays bare the question, you know, do the Jews have the right to self-determination? And if the answer is yes, okay, that's good. But if the answer is no, then the question is this a form of discrimination? Is this a form of denial of human rights? Is this a form of Jew hatred, etc.? No matter, now when you ask the question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, and you discuss it in a public forum, or if you discuss it in an intellectual arena, or in the academy, no matter what the result of that debate is in that particular setting, you've already won, because you're discussing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and you're not discussing Israel apartheid. So I think this issue is critical for many reasons, and also if only for the fact that it helps us change the focus. And honestly, there is what to debate, what to discuss. This is a very, very difficult needle to thread in terms of the logic behind it, and there is logic. And this is a discussion and a debate we should be having early and often now. And I say that because Israel continues to have legitimacy as the state of the Jewish people in most of the world, and certainly in the United States. I don't know if that will be the case in 10 years. So now is the time to discuss this. Now is the time to bring this out to the light of day. And now is the time to engage people as often as possible around this question of the right of the Jews to self-determination in the state of Israel. And like I said, once you've done it, you've already won, because the question is this anti-Semitism or not? Not is Israel an apartheid state? So we're already shifting the conversation, and the more we discuss this, the more that shift becomes a concrete. And as they say in Israel, yafa sha'a achat kodem, it's better sooner than later. So that's actually the essence a lot. That's a lot of the essence of sort of what this whole thing is about. And it's good to get to the core issue, in my view, as quickly as possible. And so I congratulate you for your work, all of you here this evening. And this is actually really the critical conversation of our times, because it is the cornerstone of the foundational cornerstone of the state of Israel, and also because it helps us win by changing the argument. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Jacob. So I am Russell Shalev. I'll be moderating today's discussion. So our guest, we have David Hirsh. David is a professor, senior lecturer of sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. His most recent book, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, was published in 2018. We have Alyza Lewin, who's the president and general counsel of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. We have Eugen Balin, who is a German lawyer and a member of the board of directors of the Central Council of Jews in Germany. And Romy Wulfsohn, an attorney based in Johannesburg, and she founded the legal division of the South African Zionist Federation in Johannesburg last year. So thank you, everybody. I'm gonna start by asking David a question. So David, you've been researching, writing, following these issues of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism for decades. But was there something different that happened in this last wave of anti-Semitism that we saw coming with the recent conflict in Gaza? And if so, how did we get here?
Well, I think we can see three developments. They're not new, but they're things that have been developing and are worrying to me. One is that there used to be a kind of a fight within the universe of Palestine solidarity politics, or politics of people who were interested in Israel and Palestine. And there was a fight between a politics of peace, that your perspective was that Israel and Palestine should make peace, and that's what you support and live together. And on the other hand, defining one of either Israel or Palestine as being an evil that wasn't a real nation and had to be got rid of. And there was a very, very strong push during this last conflict to disqualify the politics of peace, to disqualify a kind of two sides narrative, it was often said. So it was often said explicitly that the two sides narrative, the narrative of two sides, is a kind of Zionist plot, and the only people who talk about a two-state solution, who talk about an independent Palestine, are Zionists, right? And that's very interesting and very important. So that's one thing that I think has been really accelerating. The second is what I think are clearly, or what I understand as loyalty tests. Let me give you an example of tweets that were going around, and it's a very simple tweet. It says, "I am an academic and I call for a free Palestine and an end to Israeli state apartheid. This is integral to both my moral worldview and my scholarship." And then it says, "Pass it on," right? So the elements of the loyalty test are very simple. Firstly, Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is not legitimate. It's an eliminationist position. And it's generally connected to a support for boycotts for BDS. And it is described, this position is described as being foundational or integral to my scholarship and to my morality, right? In other words, if I don't accept these elements, then I'm not a real scholar and I'm not a moral person. And then it says, pass it on, right? So these are, people are signing up to this. And of course, the implication is that those of us who do not sign up to it are not proper scholars and are not moral human beings. In other words, really, basically are not human beings at all. So this idea of loyalty tests is going around. That was the very simplest, was being tweeted, but many, many academic institutions were putting out quite complex and wordy statements, all saying the same thing. So that really worries me. And these were going out not only to be signed by individuals, but to be signed by whole departments and centers and things like that. And this is clearly, to me, anti-Semitic because it gives you a worldview which the overwhelming majority of Jews cannot possibly sign up to. And it couches that worldview as being foundational to scholarship and to morality. Things were going around in the legal profession that said if you're a lawyer but you don't understand Israeli infringements of law, then you can't be a proper lawyer. And there are things like this in the medical profession and all over the place. So that's the second thing, is loyalty tests. And of course, loyalty tests resonate back in Jewish history in a very, very serious way. And I think the third thing that became more and more clear in the recent conflict was the disconnect between what people thought they were seeing and what was really happening. And there were many, many people who believed that Israel was, you know, indiscriminately bombing Gaza, was murdering Palestinians, was murdering Palestinian children, was killing, you know, literally thousands of people, was committing genocide. And if people believe that to be the case, then it's not unreasonable that they will be really, really angry, and they will say Israel is a pariah state, and all these Jews who defend it and support it and apologize for it are also a problem. So the third thing is the increasing disconnect between what's actually going on and what people think is going on when they develop their politics. And just to finish that point up, Israel is it resonates very, very strongly around the world, right? It resonates with people's own imaginations, and it becomes a way for people to describe who they are and what their politics is. So positioning yourself in relationship to this very symbolic, central, resonating narrative is very strong. And it's done, you know, in South Africa in relation to apartheid, and in Germany in relation to the Holocaust, and in Britain in relation to colonialism, and in Ireland in relation to green-orange politics, and in France in relation both to Algeria and to Vichy. So everybody finds Israel and Palestine as a kind of empty vessel into which they can pour their own stuff and perform their own identities. And of course, people have been performing their own identities, have been telling the world who they are in relation to Jews for 2,000 years. And, you know, this is kind of the birth of Christianity.
All right, thank you. If any of our panelists want to add anything, ask a question, they can do that. And if not, then I'll turn to Alyza. So one of the Louis Brandeis Center's main focuses is on protecting Jewish students on campus. So how does, right, just as David was saying, right, Israel becomes a symbol of evil. Jews support Israel. Israel becomes a symbol of racism. Jews support Israel. Jews support racism. So how does this association of Zionism and Israel with racism contribute to the marginalization of Jewish students on campus?
So thank you, Russell, for that question. And also first, thank you to the International Legal Forum for putting this program together. I'm delighted to be here and to participate with these distinguished guests. So I think the main answer to your question is on campuses today and actually beyond, there are two, I think, key terms that people don't understand. The first is Zionism, right? Zionism is not only a political ideology. Zionism is much, much more than that. In fact, for many Jews, Zionism is an integral part of their identity as a Jew, right? Judaism is not just a religion. Jews share this sense of Jewish peoplehood and this deep historic, cultural, ancestral connection to the land of Israel. So for many Jews, when they express support for the land of Israel, they're not talking about the politics and the policies of the country. What they are expressing is a pride in their ethnic ancestral heritage, right? They're linked. Their whole history of the Jewish people is linked to this land. Their Judaism, their faith is linked to this land, right? When they express that pride, when they celebrate that the Jews have once again returned to their ancestral homeland and exercised their right to self-determination there, that there is a country where the calendar is the Jewish calendar and Jews can live as Jews and carry their heads high and feel pride and exercise their faith freely, right? Kosher food's available. They don't have to worry about taking off for religious holidays. The Hebrew language is the spoken language. When they express pride in that country and all that that country does and contributes to the world, that's not talking about specific policies. That has nothing whatsoever to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And yet what happens is any Jew that feels that kinship, that feels that association to Israel, that expresses that pride in their sense of Jewish peoplehood, right now, today, as David was saying, immediately gets labeled as a racist, as a colonialist, as an oppressor, as everything that today's society has decided is our greatest evil, society's misfortune. And that leads you to the second term that people don't understand. People have no clue and don't understand what anti-Semitism is. Some people, the ones who think that maybe they understand some anti-Semitism, will recognize the anti-Semitism that resembles the Holocaust. So if they see a swastika, or if they hear a Nazi or a white supremacist, they'll say, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Or if a Jew who is very visibly, identifiably Jewish is targeted. So if you have a gunman who goes into a synagogue when Jews are in the middle of prayer and opens fire, they'll say, okay, that's anti-Semitism. Beyond that, they don't understand anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is society's oldest hatred, but it's also probably one of the least understood hatreds, because over the generations, anti-Semitism has morphed, it's changed. There's one constant, however, about anti-Semitism, and that is that no matter what the generation, no matter what the century, anti-Semitism takes whatever is that generation's greatest evil, whatever that society views as its misfortune, and it pins it on the Jew. The Jew becomes the scapegoat. The Jew is to blame. The Jew is the cause of that misfortune. And the idea is, the implication is that just, if not for the Jews, the world would be a better place, right? So the Jew was the Christ killer, or for during the Black Death, the Jews were the cause of the disease. They were the cause of the bubonic plague. For socialists or communists, it was the capitalists that were the ultimate evil, and the Jews were viewed as the capitalists, or the other way around, right? For the Jews were accused of being the communists for the capitalists. For the Nazis, where they wanted a pure Aryan race, and the Jews became the ultimate race polluters. And so what did the Nazis do? They branded the Jews with a yellow Star of David, right? They made the Jew wear the yellow Star of David. Why? Because they wanted society to exclude the Jew, to marginalize the Jew, to boycott the Jew. The idea of the yellow star was, you don't engage with that person. They're beyond the pale. They are the pariah, right? You boycott their stores. You don't use them as your professionals. You don't use them as your lawyers or your doctors. You keep them out. You deny them their place in society. What's happening today, once again, is think about what society has decided is our greatest misfortune. Our greatest evil today is viewed as racism, apartheid, settler colonialism. And not only are Jews being labeled as the cause of these greatest evils, but what's relatively new historically is we actually have a Jewish collective. We now, for the first time, have a Jewish homeland. And isn't it interesting that it is the one democracy in the Middle East where not only are all faiths and ethnicities and genders and religions, they're all equal under the law. And we now have an absolutely extraordinary, diverse government to prove it, right? That country is labeled by many as the worst offender when it comes to racism, apartheid, settler colonialism. That's today's contemporary anti-Semitism, right? That is seeking to do what traditional anti-Semitism sought to do to the individual Jews, right? Deny them their place in society. They're seeking to do that to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state, and deny it its legitimacy. See, it has no right to exist. It is the only country in the world that is illegitimate since its creation. It's a racist endeavor. Right? You can't call anything worse than that, because racism is our worst offense today. So Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish homeland. It is illegitimate. That is a contemporary form of anti-Semitism. And people don't understand that. People don't recognize that. And what we're seeing on campus, and we can come back and talk more about it later, is that Jews who express support for the land of Israel, or even just Jews as Jews, are now being marginalized and excluded. So for example, I've been working recently on a case involving Stanford, But just recently, the Hillel at Stanford sent out an email that talked about how there was one student, when they asked a classmate about an assignment, they were told, quote, "I'm not going to talk to you, Nazi." Or another student reported being told, "Don't talk to me if you're Jewish." Right? These are students who are now being marginalized and excluded. They're being shunned. They're being shunned. Jewish students are being pushed out of positions on student government. They're being pushed out of progressive clubs. Why? Because they're Jewish. Why? Because they're Zionist. Why? Because presumably that now is equated with what is, as David was saying, immoral, beyond the pale. This is how Jews are slowly being pushed out and denied their place in society. It is contemporary anti-Semitism, and we have to recognize it as such, and we have to combat it as such.
All right, thank you very much. Right, if any of our panelists have something to add, and if not, right, then I'll turn to Eugen. Eugen, so Germany obviously has a very unique history in terms of Jews and anti-Semitism. It was this history that led, in a large degree, to the Bundestag passing a non-binding resolution in 2019, recognizing the BDS movement as anti-Semitic and calling upon public institutions not to allow BDS to use its facilities. So could you please explain the subsequent developments, the backlash that's come to this decision? Where does this stand now?
Sure. Thank you, Russell, and thank you to the International Legal Forum for the great work you're doing. And it's an honor for me to speak today on this webinar. Our topic today is hatred of Jews, disguised and coded in the term anti-Zionism, old hatred, so to speak, in a new dress. Anti-Semitism is an unjustifiable attack against the intangibility of human dignity. It begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. In other words, the fight against anti-Semitism is about the fight to preserve the free democratic order, the rule of law, and the practical enforcement of human rights protection. Following the worrying development of the Nazi slogan, "Don't buy from Jews," to the slogan, "Don't buy from the Jewish state," the German Bundestag, the German parliament, passed an intersectional resolution by an overwhelming majority in May 2019, classifying the BDS movement as clearly anti-Semitic and underlining that there is no legitimate justification for anti-Semitic attitudes. The Bundestag decided not to provide federal funds and federal public spaces to BDS and groups that actively follow its goals, and not to financially support organizations that question Israel's right to exist, as well as calling on German states, cities and municipalities, and all public actors to follow suit. The German parliament underlined that an unconditional no to hatred of Jews of any nationality and the security of the state of Israel are part of Germany's raison d'etat. Previously to the Bundestag's resolution, city parliaments in Frankfurt and Munich, for example, had already passed similar resolutions, and the state parliament of North Rhine-Westphalia followed suit. After the city of Munich had decided not to provide BDS with municipal space, in a concrete case, a complaint has been filed at the Administrative Court of Munich, which found in favor of the city's decision. In the second instance, however, the higher administrative court overturned the administrative court's decision on the grounds that municipalities are not authorized to deny access to their public facilities solely on the grounds of anticipated undesirable expressions of opinion. As the sponsors of a public institution, the court said, the municipalities could not prohibit events relating to the BDS campaign directed against the state of Israel merely by referring to its anti-Semitic fundamental tendency, but only if activities of the supporters of this campaign endangered the peacefulness of the public debate. The court decided that the anti-BDS resolution passed by the city of Munich in 2017 represented an unpermissible, unjustified interference with the freedom of expression of potential facility users. It is true, the court said, that political concepts based on anti-Semitic ideas violate the free democratic basic order due to their unquestionable inconsistency with human dignity and are therefore unconstitutional. However, this finding is not sufficient in itself following the court's judgment to prohibit such expressions of opinion from the outset by the authorities. The judgment states, statements by private individuals enjoy protection under fundamental rights. The scope of protection of freedom of opinion also includes extremist, racist, and anti-Semitic statements. In my opinion, the ruling ignores reality because the statement of reasons goes on to say, in particular, there are no concrete indications to the activities of the boycott movement targeting the state of Israel in Germany could also include targeted incitement to hatred against the Jewish population of Germany, or even incitement to hatred against the Jewish population of Germany that exceeds the limits of peacefulness. Obviously, this is not true. Only, the court says, if the targeted propagation of anti-Semitic stereotypes were to provoke such exclusionary and stigmatizing effects, would this constitute a sufficiently concrete threat to the protected interest of public order to justify intervention in the freedom of expression? To my knowledge, this judgment is not final, and the case is pending before the Federal Administrative Court for an overruling of the judgment. Back to the Bundestag resolution. Last year, there was a controversial issue regarding the invitation of the South African philosopher Achille Mbembe, who had advocated BDS positions in the past and was therefore disinvited from a cultural festival only after loud protests from politics and civil society because of the anti-BDS resolutions of the Bundestag and the state parliament in North Rhine-Westphalia. In December last year, an initiative of renowned representatives from academia and culture was formed to oppose the anti-BDS resolution of the Bundestag. They have pronounced that the anti-BDS Bundestag resolution would make it impossible for them to enter into conversation or cooperation with actors from the Middle East because of the possibility that they might endorse BDS or belong to BDS. While the initiative supporters claimed to be against anti-Semitism and against BDS, they declared that they don't want to boycott BDS but to engage in open discourse. So they would like to cooperate with Israel boycotters using taxpayer funds because otherwise, in their opinion, the freedom of academia and culture would be in danger. The goal of this initiative is to reverse the anti-BDS resolution of the Bundestag. It should be emphasized at this point that the Bundestag resolution did not impose a ban on communication. It is just that no taxpayer money should be spent on hatred against Jews propagated in Germany. By the way, during the rocket attacks from Gaza on the Israeli civilian population in May and the related Operation Guardian of the Walls and the subsequent aggressive anti-Semitic so-called demonstrations in Germany in the last weeks, with anti-Semitic slogans and attacks on synagogues, we have heard little to nothing from the representatives of the mentioned initiatives, as an initiative supposedly so opposed to anti-Semitism and claiming to be in favor of the state of Israel's right to exist, which puts their credibility in serious doubt. The hate rallies of the last few weeks have shown the anti-Israel movements are linked by an anti-Semitic understanding, and anti-Semitic hatred of Israel is inseparable from hatred of Jews worldwide. In conclusion, I would like to state that the anti-BDS resolution of the Bundestag was an important step. Although the resolution does not have the quality of a law, it is a very clear political statement by the representation of the people, which should be followed.
Right, thank you. So Romy, right, so as David had said at the beginning, right, people use Israel as a sort of mirror that every society, every country, they take their own issues, their own racism, their own problems, and they throw it onto Israel as a symbol. And so, right, in South Africa, right, certainly the charge of racism, the charge of apartheid regarding Israel is very damaging. So how does association of Zionism with racism damage Jews in South Africa? I know there have been several cases of high-profile, especially high-profile jurists who have been associated with evils of Zionist racism. So could you please discuss that?
Thank you so much, Russell, and thank you to the ILF for having me tonight. And it's a really great privilege to be with such an esteemed panel. I thought I would just give you a bit of a quick context to the South African situation. In relation to other countries, South Africa hasn't been immune to the types of anti-Semitism that are manifest around the world, but it's generally held that the South African government, at least in the post-apartheid era, tries to emphasize cultural rights and religious freedom as enshrined in our renowned constitution, and also the idea of the Rainbow Nation, which Mandela famously created. So saying that the South African Jewish community generally enjoys the freedom and the ability to practice their religion, and we run our own shuls and synagogues, schools, and the government is supportive of the Jewish community as it plays a central role in the economy. So saying that South Africa generally experiences low levels of violent anti-Semitism. Although we have seen with the latest flare-up in Israel, we have seen increased levels of anti-Semitism stemming from anti-Israel fervor, as David's noted. So when it does come to Israel, we see a much more hostile position towards Israel in the South African broader community. And I would say this stems from the ANC, which is the ruling party, which opposed the apartheid racist regime, was traditionally more aligned with the PLO liberation movements, as well as the Soviet Union. And as the South African historian Milton Chain says, this explains their opposition to the idea of an ethnically defined state. So they see Israel through the prism of apartheid, with Israel as the oppressor and the Palestinians as the oppressed, and no facts or logic is going to change that sort of prism. And as Alyza was saying, that most people don't really understand what Zionism is, but in South Africa, they do understand what apartheid is. And apartheid was like the greatest evil to befall this country, and it was a crime against humanity. And so when you use that word, it has this unbelievable emotive power on people's psyche, and they no longer listen to any facts when they hear that word. So on a more practical level, we've seen this come to the fore with the issue of our Chief Justice, Mogoeng, who went onto a webinar with our Chief Rabbi, and they were discussing racism in general. And he happened to mention that he loves both Israelis and Palestinians, and that as a devout Christian, he prays for the peace of Jerusalem. And this resulted in a huge uproar from the BDS camp, and they laid a very quick complaint against him with the Judicial Services Commission. And that was dealt with very, very swiftly by our Judicial Services Commission, which usually takes years to deal with complaints against judges. There's a very famous case that's been going on for at least 10 years, which they still haven't been able to resolve against judges. But in this case, they were able to deal with it as expeditiously and swiftly as possible, which a lot of politicians have seen as very suspicious, because obviously Mogoeng here was stepping outside the lines of the so-called unwritten accepted position on Israel. But saying that, the official policy of the government of South Africa, it does support a two-state solution, and they do support peaceful negotiations. So what Mogoeng was saying was not actually that controversial. With regards to, so that hearing is still carrying on, and we will see what becomes of that. Mogoeng he was ordered to apologize publicly, which he refused to do. and the judge called him brazenly defiant, but we will see what happens with that. But as to regards to the Masuku case, which David will know quite well because he was an expert witness on that case, is also another long-standing case which has been going on, where the International Relations Secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, known as COSATU, made a speech at a rally convened by the Palestinian Solidarity Committee at the main university in Johannesburg, which is the University of the Witwatersrand. And he made blatant attacks against what he called Zionists, as well as other vicious attacks he made online. And the South African Jewish Board of Deputies laid a complaint with the Human Rights Commission, which then took it to the Equality Court to decide whether his conduct amounted to hate speech under the Equality Act, based on whether his attack on Zionists meant an attack on the Jewish community. So we got a very good ruling in that case, but unfortunately it was overturned in the following court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, finding that the connection between Jews and Zionists was not actually that, it wasn't synonymous. And while they were hurtful or offensive, they didn't amount to hate speech against the Jews. So this case is now sitting before the Constitutional Court. It probably will be heard together with the Kolani case, which was a case against offensive comments made against homosexuals in South Africa. And the Supreme Court of Appeal actually struck down parts of the Equality Act that they saw as unconstitutional. So now there is a lot of uncertainty and controversy over that legislation. And I'm actually working on an article regarding hate speech legislation in South Africa. So it's very interesting to hear the German perspective as well, because we'll also be looking at European law from that perspective. Finally, Russell, I think the Judge Desai matter, which is another separate issue that the Zionist Fed has recently dealt with, which is the case of a now retired judge of the Western Cape High Court. And we recently lodged a complaint with the Judicial Conduct Committee for his conduct that has been entirely unbecoming of a judicial officer. He has a long history of promoting BDS, and he led the Gaza March, the South African delegation to the Gaza March in 2009. He met with Hamas in South Africa and pledged his allegiance to Hamas here. He was interviewed on the Iranian news channel, and he compared our national hero Mandela to the Ayatollah, which is something just on its own is quite horrendous. But the most worrying part for us is that now he is the legal ombudsman, so he will deal with all complaints that are in the legal industry. And this is a very prestigious position. And, you know, in this role, he will have to stand for the integrity and the dignity of the profession in South Africa. So with a history like that, we don't believe that the public will have much faith in the judiciary. So are there other issues that we can talk about, like the JSC and Judge Unterhalter, but I don't know if you want to, we can talk about that later.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a general question to all the panelists. Whoever wants to answer, feel free. Right. So there's an argument that says that, okay, so it's wrong to go deface a synagogue and vandalize it with Free Palestine graffiti, but Israel claims to speak in the name of Jews. Diaspora Jews are very, very close to Israel, and right, they themselves make Judaism, Jews, Israel, Zionism seem interchangeable. So this confusion right, seems to be brought about by the Jews themselves. So maybe diaspora Jews should just take a little step back from Israel, from identification with Israel, and then they won't have to worry about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism.
That's exactly the wrong approach, right? Anti-Semitism preceded the creation of the modern state of Israel. Distancing yourself from the modern state of Israel, or even if our enemies succeed, destroying the state of Israel, is not going to end anti-Semitism. The key issue here is that Jews are being discriminated against. Jews are being marginalized. Jews are being excluded. Jews are being branded immoral pariahs and pushed out of communities that they want to engage in. They're being told, you know, if you want to demonstrate with us on LGBT rights or immigration rights or women's rights or any of these causes, climate change, the first thing you have to do is do what you just suggested: shed your connection to the Jewish people, shed this part of your Jewish identity, then you'll be acceptable and you'll be able to participate. That is crossing the line, right? We have to use the laws. We're lawyers here. We have to use the laws to protect Jews. I actually think that one of the things that we're doing in the United States that can, I think, be replicated elsewhere is when we push on campuses to try and combat this, we use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was designed to try and fight and combat segregation and make sure that all students were provided equal access to the educational opportunities provided by the universities. When students are being pushed out on the basis of national or ethnic origin, and that's what's happening now to many Jews, is they're being pushed out on the basis of their national ethnic origin, their pride in their shared ancestral heritage. When that happens, you use the law to protect them against that discrimination. Most countries around the world have protections for discrimination on the basis of national or ethnic origin. I think what we need to start doing as lawyers is get people to understand exactly what you just said, Russell, that for many Jews, Zionism is an integral part of their Jewish identity, as much as for some Jews, observing the Jewish Sabbath or keeping a kosher diet is. And while yes, there may be Jews who say that's not a part, Zionism is not a part of my Jewish identity. There are many Jews who don't observe the Jewish Sabbath or don't keep a kosher diet. But discriminating against a Jew on the basis of the fact that they observe the Jewish Sabbath is recognized as unlawful harassment and discrimination. By the same token, you don't have to be yourself a Jewish Sabbath observer to recognize that as unlawful harassment and discrimination. You don't yourself have to be a Jewish Zionist to recognize that marginalizing and ostracizing a Jew who does view Zionism as an integral part of their identity is also unlawful harassment and discrimination. And we should be trying to get that recognized as national ethnic origin discrimination around the globe.
I just want to jump in there and say I totally agree with Alyza, and I think it's really fantastic that the work you're doing there on campus. I only wish that in South Africa we would follow suit, but hopefully we will be able to follow Germany's example as well and recognize BDS as a problematic anti-Semitic institution. And you know, just speaking from a South African perspective, the Kaplan survey at the University of Cape Town found that 90% of South African Jews are very strongly affiliated to Israel and see themselves as Zionistic. So, you know, that link is so strong, especially in the South African community, that, you know, if you were to take that away, you would be basically denying the South African Jews their main source of their identity. And so, you know, judges have been asked recently while in the interviews for the Constitutional Court and that what their view is on Palestine and Israel, what their view is, whether they keep the Sabbath or not, and whether they were a member of the Jewish Board of Deputies, which is not even a political entity. So questions like that really go to the heart of, you know, they've got absolutely nothing to do with one's fitness for office or political and public life. And so those types of questions are really, really worrying. And, you know, someone's beliefs, we have a constitution, you're allowed to, you know, you have your right to belief, you have your right to freedom of expression and religion, and no one should be discriminated on that basis. And that's something that we are arguing in the Masuku case with Zionism as well.
I do agree with Alyza and Romy, but I would like to know that anti-Semites do not need Jews to be anti-Semites, and even if Israel would disappear, we would still have anti-Semites in the world. And before Israel existed, for centuries and millennia, we had problems with anti-Semitism. And also, speaking about Germany, in the eastern part, in areas where there are not so many Jews, the percentage of anti-Semitic sentiments is higher than in other regions. What is important to note also is that it's legitimate to criticize the politics of the government of the State of Israel as the politic of other governments in the world. But this is not the point where the BDS movement or anti-Semitism come to the place. They want Israel to destroy Israel, to finish, to have another genocide, another Shoah, by speaking from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, and so on. And this is the problem. And to give a response to that issue, we need to focus on prevention and repression. Talking about prevention, we have to start very early in school and explain to people what Judaism means, and also what is the foundation for the State of Israel, to make them understand. In Germany, we have the problem, for instance, that in school, the education about Judaism starts with the education about the Shoah, about killing the Jews. But this is not the right approach, obviously, as we see, because anti-Semitism is going up. And the other thing is repressive measures, which has to be taken by the parliament. And well, in Germany, we have the Commissioner Against Anti-Semitism, Dr. Felix Klein, who's working now for a national strategy against anti-Semitism, and many different measures are brought to practice. But unfortunately, we see we have a real problem also in Germany, although everything that happened in the past, so we need to do even more.
Okay, so I mean, we all know that the situation is not very good, to say the least. But there have been several important successes that Jewish communities around the world, in their respective countries, have had against anti-Semitism, whether it be in the States. Civil rights complaints, or the executive order against anti-Semitism. In Germany, the anti-BDS Bundestag resolution, which similar resolutions were passed in France, in Austria, in Czech Republic. In the UK, the Jewish community is a mobilization against Jeremy Corbyn. So my question is, what can we learn from these successes, and how can we replicate them and move them forward?
Look, if I may, obviously, although many things have been done, but it's not enough. What we realized in the last weeks on the streets, in the social media, all that hatred, it's a clear sign to the parliament and to all public authorities concerned, this is not enough. And in Germany, for instance, there is another good example of countering hatred. It's the Network Enforcement Act, that obliges social media platforms to delete hatred but it doesn't apply, for instance, not yet to a messenger platform like Telegram. So extremists, far-right extremists and Islamists moved from Facebook and Twitter and co to Telegram to spread their hatred and so on. So this is something that has to be adjusted as soon as possible.
I also, Russell, I actually think that we need more Jewish pride. I think that the answer to the increase in anti-Semitism is not to run away from and try and hide our Jewish identity, but to stand up and proclaim it proudly. And if you look at other groups that were marginalized or harassed or discriminated against, the way back from that, the ultimate in terms of the way to succeed, is not to try and blend in and erase whatever it is that makes us different. It's to proclaim it, embrace it, and then show it to the world, right? What Jews need to do is to share with the world the richness of our Jewish identity, stand proudly behind our Jewish identity. That includes our heritage, our history, our connections to the land of Israel, not an identity of victimhood. It is true that we have suffered, but there's so much more to what our Jewish identity is. And what I really hope is that maybe the silver lining in this recent escalation is that I actually think there were Jews who thought that because they were supporting their allies and because they felt that they were chiming in and criticizing Israeli policies with which they disagreed, they thought that when Jews were going to be attacked, these allies would stand up. And they realized that suddenly Jews are not only being attacked verbally, but there was a rise in physical assaults on Jews. And so many of our allies were silent, absolutely silent. And I think there were members of the Jewish community that were shocked by that silence in the face of that increased physical violence. And I think they realized suddenly, some, that not only were those allies not ready to stand up for Jews, but they also realized that when they thought they were holding hands with allies who were just seeking coexistence and that the ultimate goals of their criticism of Israel was to improve Israel and make it a better place and ultimately have a place where Arabs and Israelis and Jews and Muslims and everybody could live together in peace and harmony, they suddenly realized that for some of those allies, they didn't really support the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish homeland. They didn't recognize the right of Jewish self-determination. They weren't looking to criticize Israel in order to reform the policies of this current government. They were criticizing Israel in order to destroy Israel. And so I'm hoping that what happens as a result is that we can create a broader Jewish community that stands up and embraces our Jewish identity with pride, and that stands up against those who really seek to destroy the land of Israel and who really are not friends of the Jews. There are many, many out there who are, but we have to now try and distinguish between those who are, who genuinely seek that coexistence and support for Jews, and those who don't.
I just wanted to say, Alyza, that I totally stand by your call for unity. And I think it's very sad to see that in these times that there are ruptures with, Jews themselves standing against, as Eugen rightly said, everyone is entitled to criticize the policies of Israel and that, but and to have their own opinions, but when it comes to these points of crisis, we really have to stand together and defend our heritage. And I think, as Jacob said in the beginning, we have to take back our own narrative. And I think part of that is getting states to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I know that people have different opinions on it, but at least it's an opinion. It's a definition that Jews themselves have come up with, And we ourselves are defining what is anti-Semitism and trying to teach that to the world. And I think it's also important what Eugen said about the social media and making sure that social media networks take responsibility for what is posted online.
All right, so we're coming towards the end of our discussion, but I mean, there's another question, right? Amidst this difficult topic, there's an even more painful point, I think, in my opinion, that right, whenever we see a certain growing understanding of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, either feeding or stemming from anti-Semitism, right? There's this vocal minority of Jewish anti-Semites who really use their Jewish identity as a shield and a way to obfuscate this connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, right? So what? First of all, what does the Jewish community's response need to be? And right, how do we respond? How do we respond to this phenomenon of Jewish anti-Zionists and Jewish anti-Semites?
I think one of the things to be said, and one of the things that is important in this whole discussion, is that anti-Semitism is an external and objective social fact, right? You talked as lawyers, I'm going to talk as a sociologist. Anti-Semitism is outside of ourselves, and it is a structure which exists outside of ourselves, and it is not a kind of subjective, internal feeling, right? So people kind of wonder, how is it possible for Jews to embrace anti-Semitic politics or to argue for anti-Semitic politics? And the answer to that is, well, it's absolutely possible because we see it a lot. And it's very important. Sometimes it's said that Jewish anti-Zionists are kind of the useful idiots of some other force, but I don't think that's true. I think Jewish anti-Zionists are the kind of leaders of anti-Zionism in a sense. And I think they're pioneers. And I think they, honestly, if I was not Jewish and if I had been taught to understand anti-Semitism by an anti-Zionist Jew in the way that they do, I would be so angry when I discovered what had happened and what I had been taught. So very straightforwardly, and I think that's the downside actually of talking about sort of Jewishness and Jewish pride. I've got no problem with any of that. But of course, it's the language that Jewish anti-Zionism mobilizes very, very effectively, is a kind of language of Jewish pride. And so maybe another way of looking at it is really the opposite way, that the Zionism that we're worried about is the Zionism which is defined by anti-Zionism, right? Anti-Zionism defines me, and it creates an assumption that all Jews are Zionists unless they disavow. And the Zionism that it puts onto my head is racism. So anti-Zionism says, A, I'm a Zionist, B, I'm a racist, therefore. And just as racism constructs race, right? Race didn't exist before racism constructed race. So anti-Zionism constructs this kind of Zionism. So in a sense, I always refuse if somebody says, are you a Zionist, or tell me about your Zionism? My first answer is, it's none of your business. I'm going to deal with the Zionism that I am constructed as having. And that is that I'm constructed as being a racist and a liar. And this is very important because that's how it works. It takes a sociologist and it makes him into not a real sociologist, but a liar for Israel. It takes a lawyer, a novelist, and makes them into not a real lawyer, not a real novelist, but a kind of agent of the Israeli state. And of course, this is pure anti-Semitism, and this is how anti-Semitism works. It defines our identity. The story that Romy alluded to is really interesting, the story of David Unterhalter, who was a South African Jewish guy, big lawyer, big judge, and he was nominated to the Constitution Court. And the BDS movement said, you have been involved with the Board of Deputies in South Africa. The Board of Deputies in South Africa is Zionist. Therefore, you are Zionist. Therefore, you support apartheid. And therefore, you have no business being on the Constitution Court because your own personal and professional morality is in violation of that of your country, right? That's the logical progression. And of course, the truth is, I don't know what the truth is about his particular Zionism, but you know, there's a huge diversity of the ways in which Jews feel their own relationship to big Jewish projects. And one of the big Jewish projects in the world is Israel. So allow me to define my own relationship to Israel, and don't tell me that either I admit to being a Zionist and therefore a racist, or I must disavow Zionism, meaning disavowing racism, and that's my only opportunity, that's my only choice. So it's very important. The Zionism that is thrust upon us is very little to do with the Zionism that Jews embrace themselves. And the analogy with race and racism is relevant. Of course, you know, Black people have all kinds of self-liberating and lovely ways of understanding their own identity and their own Blackness, and that's absolutely fine. But when they're walking down a street and they see a white racist, or when they're going for a job interview and they see a white interviewer who constructs them as Black, then they're not being constructed in their own self-liberatory way. They're being constructed in a racist way. And that's what happens to Jews who are constructed as Zionist, meaning racist, and given one way of getting out of it, which is disavowal in the terms that anti-Semitism applies to us.
If I could just build on what David said, I think the way I suggest, and what I think it's a continuation of this, is to the anti-Zionist, I'm not going to convince them to be a Zionist, and I'm not interested in trying to convince them to be a Zionist. What I want them to recognize is that while Zionism may not be, and I'm talking about the way I define Zionism, not the way they're trying to define the Zionism for me, right? For me, Zionism is a part of my identity. So don't dehumanize or push for discrimination against me on the basis of my Zionism. In other words, I'm not, just like I wouldn't ask you to be a Sabbath observer, I'm also going to say to you, don't push for discrimination or dehumanization of Jewish Sabbath observers, right? Even if you yourself are not a Jewish Sabbath observer, you shouldn't be encouraging people not to hire Jewish Sabbath observers. You shouldn't be trying to say negative, nasty things to dehumanize Jewish Sabbath observers in the eyes of others so that they'll shun the Jewish Sabbath observers, right? By the same token, Zionism is a part of my identity. And you, even if it's not a part of your identity as a Jew, you should not be dehumanizing or trying to marginalize or ostracize me on the basis of my identity. All I'm asking for you to recognize is that doing that is also a form of discrimination, which you claim to be wanting to fight against. So if you really want to fight against marginalizing and ostracizing and discriminating against all different groups, don't foment hostility towards me as a Jew by demanding that somehow the way I identify as a Jew is less than human. That's what I think the answer has to be. You don't want to have Zionism as part of your identity, fine, but don't dehumanize me because it is a part of my identity.
I think it's also, sorry, so I think it's important also the question why someone believes to be an anti-Zionist, and if he really is an anti-Zionist or just wants the Jewish state, the one and only Jewish state, to disappear. I mean, if we look into the region, all the apartheid states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and so on, who are treating the Palestinians not on an equal level, and also do Jews have the same rights in Gaza? I mean, it's a joke. So we have to take anti-Zionists serious, seriously and treat them as anti-Semites, because that's what they are.
All right, thank you very much. Right, we're towards the end of our panel. Right, I wanted to at least maybe to leave on the thought that around over 100 years ago, there was a young Viennese journalist, Jewish journalist, right, who was sent to Paris to cover a story involving anti-Semitism, right, and he saw mobs in the street screaming "Death to the Jews," right. This journalist Theodor Herzl, and was shaken up by this event, and went along to start the political movement that led practically to the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. So things are very bad, but let's hope that I don't know, maybe we have some Theodor Herzls standing around and they see this and they're going to be inspired to do something that will help the Jewish world, that will change the Jewish world. So thank you again to everybody here. Everybody who is attending, if you want to know more about the International Legal Forum's work, you are welcome to follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. We have a weekly podcast, How We Fought Against. You can look it up. Yes, thank you very much to all our attendees, to all our panelists.